Assalamu alaikum, good morning, and welcome to the UAE. I'm honored that you would include me in these conversations. So all I want to do is listen, but I get the great honor of moderating our next conversation, the global view of India. We have an incredible cast of speakers and not enough time, but we'll try to do our best. I'd very much like to introduce my panel and welcome them onto stage. Mr. Shringla, please join us on stage. Lord Karan, Bilimoria, please join us. Mr. Gopal, Srinivasan, please join us. And Mr. Richard Verma, please join us on stage. Good to see you. Mina. Wonderful. Please take your seats. So we meet at a complex geopolitical moment, and the global view of India within that is going to be hugely important in the coming months. The UN vote last night, and to have the US vote alongside Russia, Belarus, and North Korea was another moment when we all took a moment to reflect on what this means for the world. But more importantly, and bigger picture, as important as the US is, there's also the view of India, particularly after the G20 presidency. And we're very lucky to have Mr. Shringla here to talk about the view of India and also the engagements you had with G20 countries, especially as the world changes when it comes to politics, economics, technology, climate, amongst the pillars that you looked at during the G20. So I want to start with you, please, to ask you about how you see the world's view of India and India's role in this complex geopolitical moment.
Thank you, and let me say what a pleasure it is to be in the Indiaspora Conference for Good and to meet so many of our good friends in one place. To answer your question, Mina, let me take you back to 2020, early 2020 actually, when the pandemic was just breaking out and a lot of developing countries, small countries, were facing enormous problems in dealing with that challenge. And that's the time that Prime Minister Modi called for a special session of the G20. And Saudi Arabia, at that time, was the chair of the G20. They convened an extraordinary session. And at that session, Prime Minister Modi said, and I can, G20 meetings normally are not on, they're not in the public domain. But since I was in the room, I can share this here. Prime Minister Modi said that this was the first time the G20 was convening on something that was not financial or economic, but humanitarian in nature. And he called for, and I'm quoting him, a human-centric globalization. And it would, I think the G20 then took a number of measures that were very, very far-reaching, including a debt moratorium. India, of course, from that point onwards, I think moved towards a policy where we work for the global common good, what we call a Vishwamitra, a friend of the world. And let's start with COVID. I mean, we all recall the problems during COVID. India was one of the few countries that produced its own indigenous vaccines. We were quick to share our vaccines, probably the only country that shared vaccines across the globe, including in the Gulf. And talking about the Middle East, of course, I'll give you two examples. One was Kuwait. Kuwait came to us and said, look, we have enormous problems in dealing with COVID. How do we deal with it? And we spent a rapid response team of doctors and nurses, and they dealt with it. And the second concerns UAE, and many of our friends are here from the UAE. There was a time when there was a strict lockdown across the globe, and the UAE appealed to us saying that we need food provisions. Despite the lockdown, I think we made a special dispensation. We opened a food corridor where aircraft would come in, pick up food in India, supplies, and then bring them into the UAE. But that policy continued in a way that I think was both in terms of assisting other nations, especially developing countries, carried on into our G20 presidency when before we became president, we consulted all of our Global South partners, what we call the Friends of Global South, and what their expectations of our presidency would be in the G20. We also ensured that the African Union was included in the G20's membership. And the other big change, I think, in terms of our own, the way we conducted our foreign policy was really going from a reactive foreign policy 10 years ago to a proactive leadership-driven foreign policy. I mean, in the earlier days, I remember, we waited for others to take the initiative. The US took the initiative, the UK took the initiative, China took the initiative. But today, the difference is that we are placing our narrative on the global agenda. So whether it is Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam, the world is one family, well before Donald Trump came on the scene and with his vision of putting an end to conflicts, I think Prime Minister Modi had already made it very clear that we believe that this is not an era of war, that we are on the side of peace. We are not on any side in the conflict. And he himself invested time to go and meet both President Putin and President Zelensky in an effort to bring peace to that area. So I think the change, whether it is inputting into the global narrative, is very much there today in India. And I know time is short, but I'll just conclude with something I recall from last evening. I had gone across to the mandir yesterday, and an incredible, I would say, site in this region, and all that credit goes to the UAE for allowing this wonderful, place of worship to come up. Swami Brahma Vihari Das, who is actually the brilliant mastermind behind the success of this initiative, he, in conversation, told me, he said, and I recall very clearly, he said, everyone wants peace. Even those who wage war want peace. They just don't know how to do it. And so with our moral authority, with our ideological, I would say, balance, because today we are in the happy position where we are regular invitees to the G7, we are members of the Quad, but yet we are members of the BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We straddle that ideological space between North and South and East and West. I think India is very well placed to bring that balance into the global order and contribute in a very positive way to bring about peace, tolerance, harmony, and coexistence in the world today.
Thank you very much. I mean, the point also about everybody wants peace is often they want peace on their terms. And so how do you convince them to be open to compromise, which I think is one point that you raise about harmony and building bridges. And India has an important role to play. So we see this as India's view of the world. Mr. Verma, I want to turn to you and ask you, how is India viewed as a diplomat, of course, in several important and senior positions, also as ambassador to India previously, and of course, most recently, in your position at the State Department. How is India viewed from the world, and can it play a role in this geopolitical moment to ease tensions?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, and good morning, everybody. And MR, thank you for coming up with this idea 14 years ago. Came into my office and said, I've got this idea to get people together. I said, good luck, and here we are, 14 years later with an incredible crowd. And Ambassador, you really are the modern architect of U.S.-India relations, so thank you for everything that you've done. It's been incredible. Look, there's incredible excitement about India and India's role in the world. About 10 years ago, I started giving a talk about the India of 2030, when India would lead the world in almost every category. Obviously the most people, but the largest middle class, the most internet users, the most college graduates. You're building 50 new airports right now, the biggest migration of people from rural areas into city areas, third largest economy, third largest military. And so obviously the scale and excitement is so obvious when you go to India and you see this firsthand. I was able to go to every state in India, witnessed incredible things happening. US presidents have known this for decades. You go back to Eisenhower talking about if the US and India were the closest of friends, the world would be a safer, more peaceful place. President Kennedy said the hinge of Asia rests with India. The hinge of fate in Asia rests with India. President Obama, President Biden said that this was the most consequential relationship of the future. But it was President Clinton's visit in 2020 that really set us on a new course. And he laid out 4 areas of cooperation: defense, trade, sustainable development, and energy. And I would say for 25 years, we have made incredible progress along those 4 pathways. We went from 0 in defense trade to 23 billion. We went from a few tens of billions in two-way trade to now over 200 billion. We went from a few 100,000 visitors, Indian visitors to the United States, to now well over 1 million every year, and well over 1 million Americans to India. 300,000 Indian students. So we have surged in so many areas in our climate and healthcare. And so 25 years, incredible progress. Your question, I think, building upon the meeting of President Trump and Prime Minister Modi, which was a good meeting. They have a good relationship. But I think we're in a different era. And I will say, I think that 25-year period has come to an end, and we are entering a different period. And some would say, well, is that meant to suggest we're in a negative place? No. We have a very strong relationship. We're a very positive relationship. But I think it's decidedly different. If you look at the joint statement between President Trump and Prime Minister Modi, for the first time, it talks about shared interests, not shared values. For the first time, there is no mention of collaboration on health. There's no mention of sustainable development goals. There's no mention of climate or clean energy or solar or wind or battery storage. There is a focus on 2 of those 4 pillars that President Clinton talked about: trade and security. So we are entering, I think, a much narrower relationship, a much more focused relationship. It doesn't mean it's bad or good, but I will say for this room in particular, it puts enormous burdens on all of you. Just the closing of USAID in India after 60 years, $17 billion, 555 projects, ending tuberculosis, ending malaria, working with farmers, working on clean water, working on sanitation. These were not charity projects, as all of you have talked about. These were joint research, joint development projects that, frankly, we were trying to scale and take to Africa, Latin America, other parts of Asia. It was Prime Minister Modi who said the real value of the U.S.-India relationship is not what we do for each other, it's what we do for the world. I think that part has ended. It's up to you to fill that void.
Thank you. I think the applause indicates challenge accepted. Lord Bilimoria, I want to ask you, of course, from UK perspective and a wider European perspective, the view of India at this moment, a very confident, able India that can play a role, as we just heard, not only in peace when it comes to Ukraine, Russia, looking at the possibility of mediation, but also on the global stage of setting what the new global order looks like. What's the view from Europe?
Whenever I host people in Parliament, and I, at the outset, want to thank MR, Sanjeev, Indiaspora, Nina, thank you. What a fantastic organization, what a great event, bringing all of us together, and the magical moments that have taken place over the past hours, I think we'll all remember and will benefit from. But I've had the privilege of hosting Indiaspora twice in Parliament last year. And I showed people around, and there's a painting in St. Stephen's Hall of the first British ambassador, Sir Thomas Roe, presenting his credentials to the Mughal Emperor Jahangir. And that was in 1614. So when we say we have a 400-year relationship with India, it is a 400-year relationship. And where are we today? Where India has overtaken the UK, is now the 5th largest economy in the world, and the UK is the 6th largest. But you know, this is not about scale and numbers. It's about mutual respect and partnership and collaboration. Look at us here in the UAE. The UAE makes up less than 1% of India's population, and yet is seen as a respected partner of India. With huge, huge things going on between the two countries. The UK is less than 5% of the population of India, and yet we can still be equal partners in terms of mutual respect and capabilities. And this is where I think, I'm sorry, the UK has not been doing particularly well in terms of world image. You know, look at what happened in 2016. You had two global events in 2016. Brexit and Trump being elected for the first time. And I remember Professor Rabi Abdullah at Harvard Business School in January 2017 doing an analysis of Brexit and Trump, and he did a similar analysis of Trump's victory just now, of the Republicans and the Democrats, and I tell you, it is identical, the fault lines. Pro-immigration, anti-immigration, rural, urban, more educated, less educated, older, younger. You can just divide it. And Brexit? How many of you, by the way, think Brexit was a huge mistake and an act of self-harm for the UK? Can I see a show of hands? I see this around the world. Somebody should take a picture of this and send it to Boris Johnson. Yeah, we've had 5 prime ministers under the Conservative Party after David Cameron. One of them lasted for 49 days, Liz Truss. You know, this is unfortunately the image we have. And now we have a Labour government that wants growth, but has had a budget that's put in anything but generation of growth and promotion of entrepreneurship. And yet, what I say is this. I talk to people, and people talk about these issues about the UK. I say, what happens when you have resilient countries with strong democracies? And that's what the same thing about India and the UK. We have a phenomenally strong democracy. India, Prime Minister Modi elected for the 3rd time, this time with a coalition government. You've got that continuity and strong leadership. Our democracy has thrown up what we've got at the moment. What you cannot change in a country like the UK is our institutional strength. And I think the combination of hard and soft power, there are very few countries in the world that have real combination of hard and soft power. And I think India does have it, and I think the UK has it in abundance. Our nuclear deterrent, by the way, the at-sea nuclear deterrent that we have that will now have to protect Europe along with France if the US pulls out of NATO or withdraws, that's going to be crucial for world security. So our defense force is small but powerful. Our financial services, we're still 1 or 2 in the world in financial services. Our professional services, our lawyers, our accountants, our creative industries, the best in the world. Our film, best in the world. We have phenomenal manufacturing. We're still one of the top 10 manufacturers in the world. And our soft power, the BBC watched by 500 million people every week. The royal family, Her Majesty the Queen, when she passed away, respected around the world. The Majesty the King respected around the world. And as for Premier League football, hundreds of millions of followers around the world. So that strength, I think, is very much robust and very much there, regardless of how incompetent our leadership may be from time to time, as we've seen. And where Europe is concerned, this is, again, an issue with Europe. By the way, Europe now has the President of the Council, Antonio Costa, of Indian origin, of Goan origin. We've just had a Prime Minister of Indian origin. And that's the other thing about this conference that demonstrates the Indians reaching the very top in every field, and that makes me feel so, so proud.
So, strength of institutions and strength of democracies being 2 important pillars of UK-India ties. I want to turn to Mr. Srinivasan, please. And I want to ask you, as you, of course, through the many relationships you have and the work that you do, and looking at not only economic foundations, but also tech, where the future is going. How do you see the world's view of India, and what's India's role when we look at both the economic and technological changes that are happening?
Thank you, and again, my congratulations to everybody at Indiaspora, MR, and the team to put such a wonderful group of people together in such a wonderful location. See so many friends here. You know, I was pondering for the last 5 minutes, or I guess maybe more than 5 minutes, as to what I'm doing in this panel. So let me first...
You're grounding it, you're grounding.
So let me just reflect on that, because I'm the only person for whom leaving India once a year is a big event. And sometimes I don't even leave India once a year. So I know every nook and corner of India, and I find there are many nooks and corners I still need to know. So I was just reflecting on all these very distinguished people and their wonderful comments that they were making. And what struck me from just an entirely Indian perspective, right, is that today in a world where everybody has stripped themselves of idealism and innocence and any kind of posturing of how high their values are and so on and so forth. It is the same Eisenhower who regretted his pro-Pakistan policy towards the end of his first term. So let us not forget also those aspects of life, right? So I think with all this innocence gone, everybody is very, very blatantly standing naked with their self-interest across the world. That's how it seems to me. And Ambassador Shringla cannot say that. I don't know whether he thinks that, but I can certainly, even if he thinks, he will not be able to say that in a public forum. None of these positions I'm able to freely say that. India, Indians, Indianness are three different things, all interrelated. Everybody wants to have a relationship with India. In a decade from now, we will have some kind of maybe $20,000 per family per capita, which means we're going to be a very big source of consumption. We have tons and tons of wonderfully talented, skilled men and women who can serve the world through GCCs and so on. Then we have Indians who go, many of them overseas, very accomplished in what they do. We keep, even now, for some strange reason, still celebrating, oh, we have a Indian, in this position, that position. I don't know why we celebrate this. It's fairly obvious that talented people are required everywhere in the world, and every country will use talented people to their best of their benefits. Indians will also not hesitate to use non-Indians for their own benefit. There's nothing unique about it, just a pure, simple, pragmatic self-interest that people are pursuing in terms of talent. So Indians are everywhere. We have many Indians, fortunately, to support the world and give them into positions of whatever way they can serve the world and benefit for themselves. But there is something called Indianness, which I think, and I noticed that there is a Maharaj from the Ramakrishna Mission, there is a Swamiji from the ISKCON sitting here. There is something called Indianness. And I think what India has to do, and Prime Minister Modi did that when he talked about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam in G20, but I think that's just the beginning. That the Indianness is something that we can actually offer more to not only within India, but to the world. What values and our ability to make tolerance an intrinsic part of our life, our ability to accept other person's point of view without necessarily giving up our points of view, and how to work in harmony. I think Vijay spoke very well about community and families coming together. I think that is the value of Indianness that we have. And that is something that will sustain us and will continue to sustain us. We were not having the world's highest GDP during the Mughal era for no reason. So obviously we've been very entrepreneurial, very enterprising, otherwise we wouldn't have been there. So it's not like we're going to discover something new by becoming prosperous again. We're just going to go back to what we were, right? And places like Dubai, the merchants of this area, have long since known that when they traded with India. Here are also very enterprising people. Sailing and navigation and marine life is so incredibly intertwined with the Emirati culture ever since time we know. So given all of that, I think with this Indianness which will steer us, the problem we have to confront right now in India is how to scale. We don't really understand scale well, which is kind of odd when we're having Kumbh Mela, where one country like Greece is coming every day to attend the Kumbh Mela. I was also one of those people who attended, as was MR. How do we understand scale? Because I think for us to become a very responsible role in the world with 20% of the population has to be our ability to manage institutions better, to manage scale. We need institutionalization, whether it is of religious organizations like the Ramakrishna Mission, whether it's of our regulators who are much maligned every day in the newspapers, whether it is other social organizations, the way we run government. We have a situation, we have a very unique position in the country where India is the only country in the world, a democracy, which does not have a third-level democracy. It's a very big issue. We have a bill in Parliament called the Anti-Defection Bill, which prevents representatives from voting on what they believe is good and have to follow the party whip, otherwise they get expelled because of some 1990 incident of very good intentions of the then Prime Minister. So we have many such issues of building scales. When I look at India, I look at saying, how do we build institutions? How do we build institutions in our own shape and form, not try to copy anybody else? And without these institutions, whether it's social, whether it's political, we will struggle. I think economically we'll figure it out because that's something we know from time immemorial, right? But how do we, even there we have many challenges because we have a dominance of 3-4 large groups. We need about 100 such groups in India for scale. So everywhere we need more institutionalized ways of working in an Indian institutionalized way using our formula of Indianness. So I'm sorry, I don't know much about the world at all. I run a private equity fund where we do not accept anything other than rupees. Yeah. So I'm kind of very, very India-centric in my approach. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you very much. So unfortunately, we only have 5 more minutes left for this panel. So I'm going to ask each of you very briefly, since with your incredible experience and understanding of course, India and the world, what is one event or policy issue that you're keeping your eye out for in the next year, in the coming year? So in 2020, if we were to meet again in February 2026, what's one issue that you would think has impacted the world and that you're keeping an eye out, and of course, India's place in the world? So I'm going to start with our last speaker and then work my way back up.
Who knows the least about the subject? But I think from an Indian point of view, at least in India, right, I think the thing that we have to deal with are much more related to our internal issues. Because therefore, in my mind, what we are looking for in India is more where we will go as Indians. And I'm not sure that the international issues are going to be the more important thing for us, because everybody will, the distinguished speakers will know more about this subject. But we are looking at the one thing that the Prime Minister, the Finance Minister, and the Chief Economic Advisor spoke about, and that is deregulation. Because the biggest thing holding back India right now is over-regulation, which came from very good reasons of the past, but are not relevant for the needs of the future. So I think it's a very Indian-centric view, but now the Prime Minister is talking about deregulation commission after his visit, maybe inspired by Doge, I don't know, when he saw it in America. But I think we're looking at more deregulation, and that will really unleash the entrepreneurial forces, as my friend Ashish Dhawan made in his opening remark in the first panel.
Thank you.
So it's really hard to pick one issue. You mentioned the vote at the UN last night. We could talk about that all day and the dramatic change that is in a U.S. position. We could talk about the advances in technology and both tech for good and tech being used for bad purposes. But the one issue that I just want to raise for everybody is what's going to happen with immigration. You know, there's 31 million of us, I think, that have left India. My dad tells a great story about arriving in the United States with $14 and a bus ticket in 1963. Heard that story so many times growing up. Sometimes he had $22, sometimes he had $14, but you get the idea. He started over with next to nothing, took a big risk. 50 years later, his kid gets to go back to India as the U.S. ambassador. That is the immigrant story, right? That's winning the lottery 50 times over. I think what we all have to remember is that those stories are happening today, next week, next month. There is another person landing at JFK this week with $14 and a bus ticket. What's our reaction to him or her going to be, to their family? That's happening in other countries around the world. These isms that we're dealing with, populism, nationalism, authoritarianism, fascism, as you get further and further down the line, they become harsher and harsher to the immigrant story. And it really is up to all of us not to forget about where we came from, not to forget about those journeys, not to pick up the ladder and say we got here all on our own, and remember all those people who are really struggling to make it. And that's why I love this organization so much, because I know you won't forget about their stories too.
Thank you.
In many ways, I look back, just following on from Rich, what you just said, that I went from, born in Hyderabad, 19-year-old student, to study in the UK. And people talk about the American dream. Well, in many ways, I've lived the British dream. I built a business, Cobra Bear, from scratch, a household name in the UK. I've been a university chancellor twice. I was one of the youngest people appointed to the House of Lords. I've been there for 18 years. I've been president of the Confederation of British Industry, not just the first Indian, the first ethnic minority ever to be president of the Confederation of British Industry. I've done all these things because Britain has given me the opportunity to do that. So I'm proud to be British. I'm proud to be a British Asian. I'm proud to be a Zoroastrian Parsi. But wherever we are in the world, we integrate in the countries that we live in to the best of our abilities, but we are always Indian, and I'm always proud to be Indian. And the point I want to make is a thing that we take for granted and we don't appreciate enough. Whether it's the 30 million of us around the world or whether it's the 1.4 billion Indians in India, our greatest strength is we are the most diverse country in the world by miles. And that diversity, from the 100,000 Zoroastrian Parsis to the 20 million Sikhs, to the 200 million Muslims, to the billion Hindus, to the races, the languages, the cultures, the terrain, no country comes close to it. And we managed to hold it all together in this phenomenal democracy. That is the strength of India that we need to keep harnessing and never, ever taking for granted and always appreciate.
Don't put the mic down. You didn't answer my question. What's the one policy issue
The one policy
this year? So we had migration. We had India internally deregulation. What would be yours that people should keep an eye out on?
by far, it's got to be, from India's point of view, has got to be right at the center of the world in getting this unstable, uncertain, dangerous situation that we're in, where quite frankly, we're closer to the brink of a world war than we've ever been since World War II. We've got to prevent that.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Shringla, if I can give you the last words on that geopolitical moment and anything else you'd like to add.
Yeah, last but not the least. Well, I'll take up from where Karan left off. Essentially, I think, let's come to the region that we are in now, the Middle East, or West Asia as we call it. I think we came very, very close to being drawn into a larger conflagration in the Middle East. When Iran and Israel were raining missiles on each other, we were one step away from being drawn into a larger regional conflict. And there was great concern back at home because we have 9 million of our diaspora living in the Gulf region. We depend greatly on the Gulf for our energy. And of course, it's a very, very critical part of the world. And I think if we look at this region, we are not beyond that risk today. Every day is a new day, and every day is the risk of some unforeseen eventuality exists. And I think the advent of Donald Trump into the global scene has probably exacerbated these risks. I mean, look at it this way. He's upended a traditional view of global diplomacy. I mean, from Ukraine to Russia, bilateralism to multilateralism, and from the Middle East two-state solution to a coastal resort in Gaza. So it's definitely a change. But I think from India's point of view, given our own experiences in digital transformations, climate change, dealing with issues that are inclusive, that are, in some senses sustainable and tech-driven, we want to provide solutions wherever we can. And there are two initiatives that are in the Middle East that are very, very important. One is what we call the I2U2. I think this has been explained before. Israel, India, UAE, and the United States. The other is the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor. Both of these reinforce the Abraham Accord. And if you notice, when Prime Minister Modi went to the United States about 10 days ago, the joint statement referred to both of these initiatives as being extremely important and which would be taken forward. The first initiative came during Trump's first term and the second during the Biden era. And I think those are going to be, real game changers in the region. And the diaspora will have a very important role to play in both these. And a very quick word on the diaspora. When you conduct foreign policy, and I think one of the major differences in our conduct of foreign policy today is the role of the diaspora. I think no factor, from my personal point of view, has been greater and more instrumental in helping us achieve our goals of a very different conduct of foreign policy from India than the support that we received from the diaspora. And coming from a perspective in the United States, let me say, not because he's here in the room, but no one has contributed more to supporting India's tech and startup sector than MR himself. He's been the person who has mobilized the US venture capital sector to take a close look and to support the Indian tech industry. And this is what I mean by the role of the diaspora. I think that is critical and will continue to be more and more important as our diaspora grows and becomes important across the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The global view of India often comes through diaspora, where people often meet an Indian that has immigrated or is of Indian heritage in their own country, and through that builds relations. There's a lot more we could do, but unfortunately our panel has to run up. Indianness, importance of diaspora, but also finding ways of building projects like the IMEC project and the economic corridor. Importance to avoid, God forbid, a world war at a very precarious moment, but the importance of migration. I'm a lucky migrant. I've from a family of refugees to them becoming a migrant here in the UAE, seeing the value of allowing immigration and legal migration and finding ways that can work, that many of us, almost all of us here, have benefited from. Thank you very much to my excellent panel, and thank you all for attending.